colleagues to address questions to Mr. Costin before we go on to our other expert witnesses. So, Mr. Abraham, if I could kindly invite you to give us a brief introduction. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, thank you very much. And let me first of all stress and underline how honored I really feel having been chosen as a rapporteur on the extremely important issue of commemorating the 19th anniversary of the Holodomor of 1932 and 1933 in Ukraine. It's of significant importance not only for Ukraine facing genocide again, but for the whole of Europe. It's a real pan-European issue, how to deal with the truth in history and publicly speak about it. Especially saying that and speaking to you as a German, knowing about how important it is to bring full light in the darkest chapters of history and to have a clear wording on that. And all this is very challenging in a situation as Ukraine is today, facing military aggression and various disinformation campaigns, including on Holodomor. It's my pleasure to welcome here in Paris Professor Schulze-Wessel from the University of Munich. Thank you, Professor, for having come from Munich for this event. Online, we have the pleasure to welcome our two Ukrainian experts, Professor Hitsak from the University of Lviv and the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, Mr. Kostin. The Prosecutor General is particularly busy man in these terrible times for Ukraine, and his participation is a signal how important the issue of Holodomor is for the Ukrainian people still today. As I learned during my preliminary research, most Ukrainians have family members who died or narrowly escaped a dreadful death during this man-made famine. And they suffered a lot from the denial and the leaden silence imposed by the Soviet regime until Ukraine became independent and researchers were finally able to access the archives located on its territory and establish the facts in an objective manner. It so happens that our two academic experts know each other well. They are co-chairs of the Ukrainian-German Historians Commission and have worked together on the Holodomor before. Between them, they will give us a clear and complete picture of the facts of the Holodomor and the state of discussion among historians. Prosecutor Kostin will present the working methods and results of the judicial investigations against Joseph Stalin and others carried out by the Ukrainian security and prosecution services. I have asked also Mr. Kostin to draw a line between the crime committed against the Ukrainian people back in the early 30s and the ongoing crimes committed in the ongoing Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. As documented in the report by Davor Stier we adopted this morning, there are strong indications that Russia is once again planning to destroy the Ukrainian nation as such by committing atrocities against civilians, as Davor Stier and others came across in Bucha and Irpin, a reign of terror in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine by abducting tens of thousands of Ukrainian children to Russia and a bombing campaign against civilian infrastructures and housing, turning millions of Ukrainians into refugees by making living conditions impossible. I now look forward to hearing from our experts and to the discussion we'll have with them, and I give the word back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Prosecutor General, we're most obliged that you're able to join us, and I understand that your time is limited, and don't hesitate to indicate when you have to leave us. But could I invite you to address us, and then I'll invite colleagues to ask questions for as long as you feel able to accommodate them. Thank you, Prosecutor General. Please continue.
Thank you. Dear Lord Richard Keane, respectful members of the committee, friends and colleagues, good afternoon. Let me start by expressing my sincere gratitude to the Committee on Legal Affairs and Human Rights, as well as the Council of Europe and its institutions for recognition and commemoration of the Holodomor, the Great Famine, as an act of genocide against Ukrainian people. We equally value your support and commitment to Ukraine while we defend our sovereignty and statehood and seek justice and accountability for the international crimes committed by Russia in course of the aggressive war. Let me also use this opportunity to express our gratitude to all those states and international organizations that recognized Holodomor as genocide, honoring the memory of all the victims and voicing the truth so well hidden in the Soviet past. The 2010 resolution of the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly commemorating the victims of the Holodomor reads, "The Assembly decides to recognize the Great Famine, the Holodomor, as an act of genocide intended to break the backbone of Ukrainian nationhood, language, and culture." I believe this statement is an important departure point for what we will discuss today. In this hearing, you have asked us to look deep into the past to understand the patterns, intentions, and systematic rigor of Moscow attempts to destroy any independent Ukrainian state. The Holodomor of 1932-1933 was a story Ukrainians carried alone and in silence for far too long. Only in the past few decades, the tragic history of Holodomor became recognized and acknowledged outside of Ukraine. Therefore, I will present some of the findings of two investigations from 2009 and 2019 conducted by the Security Service of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Prosecutor's Office, and which were assembled into cases against top Soviet and other high-level officials who designed and executed the mass artificial famine against Ukraine as an act of genocide. In 2009, a first Ukrainian investigation of the Holodomor was conducted with the evidence discussed and heard in a Ukrainian court. Investigators from Ukraine's security service collected thousands of the documents pertaining to the Holodomor from archives of Soviet materials in 17 regions of Ukraine, and by request to foreign nations who had consular or diplomatic presence in the Ukrainian SSR in 1930 to 1933. Investigators conducted interviews with 2,000 surviving witnesses of the Holodomor. They identified new 857 mass burial pits, and with analysis of available documents, judged that at least 3,941,000 Ukrainians had died as a result of Great Famine. The prosecutor's office reviewed the findings of this investigation, which established that the leaders of the Bolshevik totalitarian regime, including Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postyshev, Kosyor, Chubar, and Khatayevich, had, on the territory of Ukrainian SSR, organized and perpetrated genocide by creating conditions designed to destroy a part of the Ukrainian ethnic group. In accordance with Ukrainian law, all these perpetrators are deceased. The case was submitted to the Kyiv Court of Appeal for examination. In court's examination of the evidence, they offer the following to summarize the case. I start the quote. "The criminal investigation body has fully and comprehensively established that the special intention of Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postyshev, Kosyor, Chubar, and Khatayevich to destroy a part specifically of the Ukrainian and not any other ethnic group, and has objectively proved that this intention applied specifically to a part of Ukrainian ethnic group as such. On the basis of a thorough analysis and comprehensive assessment of circumstances presented in the resolution regarding the crime of genocide committed, the evidence amassed which confirms this and the conclusion that it was perpetrated by Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Postyshev, Kosyor, Chubar, and Khatayevich with direct intent, namely in order to destroy a part of Ukrainian ethnic group as represented by Ukrainian peasantry." End of quote. The evidence presented in the court summary details the decision-making as Ukrainian regions were systematically targeted by measures designed to remove all food supplies, First, through the imposition of unrealistically high grain quotas, then in the removal of other foodstuffs as penalty for failing to meet the quota. Villages were placed on black boards for failing to meet quotas. In some places, if every settlement was listed. Force was used to collect the food, and force was used to trap people in the famine zones. Interior checkpoints were created and borders closed to prevent the starving population from going elsewhere in search of food. Information could not get out. Simplified procedures were developed to penalize, deport, or execute those who resisted, or any who attempted to provide aid. The leaders named in this case knew of the famine, kept the measures causing it in place, and escalated them. Their awareness is evident in the mundane reports and orders they issued. Grain was exported abroad from Ukraine to France, Italy, Greece, Egypt, North America, Germany, Netherlands, the Far East, as Ukrainians starved. In areas where the famine had been severe, tens of thousands of Russian and Belarusian families were resettled on the land as a planned demographic change. Exports continued. People died. At the peak of the Holodomor in June 1933, at least 28,000 people died of hunger every day. That's 1,168 per hour. 20 dead every minute. People were buried in hundreds of mass graves. Many of the dead were children. There are descriptions of the uncared for children, the orphans of famine, wandering in search of survival or safety, and then the orders to stop their movement and discussions of how to eliminate them. Genocide is distinguished from the crimes against humanity by the nature of the intention of the crime and by its targeting against a clearly defined group. The 2009 investigation detailed both elements with regard to the Holodomor, and the court supported those findings. In 2019, an additional investigation commenced in order to identify the persons who implemented the decisions of Stalin and others on the territory of Ukraine. The new investigation also gathered additional evidence and analysis, in particular to re-examine the question of the death toll of the Holodomor. It is clear now that somewhere between 4 million and 10.5 million Ukrainians were killed by the Holodomor, a significantly higher number than 2009 figure. In 2019-2020, 12 leaders of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine were identified as key implementers, as well as 5 heads of punitive bodies and the first secretary of North Caucasus Regional Committee of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, thus increasing the circle of perpetrators of this crime. Additional evidence and analysis were also provided via various comprehensive forensic examinations of different materials, archived documents, and witness statements. The new examinations established that the vast majority of these deaths were caused by famine and diseases connected to forced starvation, and that the communist totalitarian regime committed genocide against Ukrainians in order to eliminate the national liberation movement, destroy the Ukrainian nation, and prevent the restoration of Ukrainian state. Stalin had a monopoly on power, and therefore he organized and committed the crime of genocide with the help of the other perpetrators mentioned in course of investigation. Stalin's famine was a prison from which no one could escape. The details of how this story was systematically suppressed also demonstrate awareness of how great the crime was that has been committed. For Ukrainians who survived the Holodomor, the psychological devastation was as vast as the demographic. Ukrainian grain still fed the world, but not one grain of it was left for the starving peasants of the Black Earth. No help came. They understood this hell on earth was for them. Survival became its own kind of shame, because surviving meant you had watched others weaker than you, in your own family, your own community, die. And you knew that there was nothing you could do but choose to help them and die with them, or to live a little longer, hoping for some kind of survival. In Stalin's attempt to prevent the restoration of Ukrainian state, he ensured through this shared silent history that Ukrainians would understand that independence was survival. We have been reminded of this every day since 2014. In July 2021, over 5,000 plus words and 20 pages, Putin wrote an essay claiming that Russians and Ukrainians are one people. All this is a justification and pretext to occupy and annex Crimea in 2014, to attempt and strip Ukraine of its statehood through full-scale invasion in 2022. As the world can witness vividly, Stalinist intention now being articulated by Putin. An updated playbook of Stalinist terror implemented at scale in territories occupied by Russian forces. The weaponization of grain still continues as we speak. They are employing new methods as well, kidnapping Ukrainian children and adopt them into Russian families, so they forget who they are. If they can't kill us all in this generation, they want to steal the next one from us. The shadows of the past and the darkness of Putin's future alike. For 70 years, Stalin's manufactured famine and genocide of Ukrainians were virtually unknown. And this is why Ukrainian investigators and prosecutors felt it was essential to provide evidence of what had been done. This helps to inform our analysis of what Russia does to Ukraine today with its war of aggression. Putin tells us very openly, through words and actions, what they aim to achieve: the destruction of Ukrainian identity, history, and culture. 90 years on from the Holodomor, and Moscow offers its neighbors only the same terror and brutality and oppression. It is a vision that must be defeated. It's time for us to prevent repetition of the gruesome and tragic history. With that in mind, I would like to use this opportunity and appeal to all members of the Council of Europe to support our motion for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe resolution commemorating 19th anniversary of Holodomor of 1932-1933 in Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Prosecutor General, for that very moving account of events, albeit 90 years ago, still very, very obvious and immediate for those in Ukraine who have recollection of those events. I would like to invite colleagues, if they would like to raise questions with the Prosecutor General, and if they could indicate, please, with their card. Could we begin with Mr. Abraham? Thank you. And then Mr. Badan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Prosecutor General. It's really been very touching listening to you and to learn about all these terrible details of the crimes. And I understand, of course, that opening the criminal case was extremely important for the victims and the relatives to give justice. But my question is now, what is happening now with all your evidence, with the findings of this criminal case? Is it open for research? Is it open to public? Because it's so necessary to learn about these details. How do you handle the evidence?
We have thousands of documents, as I mentioned, in course of our investigation, and they are not secret. They are not open to public, but in case of request, they could be shared with the scholars, historians, in order to use them in your very important work. This investigation is not finished, and of course, we would like to have the result. While we understand that it's important to have the concrete results and to understand that we have used all possible avenues in order to collect everything possible at the moment to finalize our investigation. And it's critically important not only for the victims of the Holodomor, it's critically important to show to those who inherited the same pattern of commission of brutal international crimes, to show that there will be no impunity. Because accountability in justice is always about deterrence, deterrence of commission of the same crimes by the same perpetrators, those who inherited the same style of policy, and also deterrence which should be showed to other potential perpetrators and to prevent commission of such crimes in the other parts of the world.
Mr. Vardanyan, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prosecutor General. I understand how it is important to remember the past, and that such kinds of international crimes shouldn't be forgotten in any case. And you're absolutely right mentioning that this was a crime against the Ukrainian identity, because identity was actually the main aim. The elimination of identity is the main aim of the genocide perpetrators. I would like just to say that I'm fully sharing with you the qualification of what you said, but I have two questions. The first, you said that we should separate genocide from the crimes against humanity. For sure, now, in accordance with the statute of ICC, they are separate type of crimes, but we are speaking about the situation existed before the Genocide Convention. I'm saying this being somehow in brackets devil's advocates, because I understand the Russian propaganda will trying to do all the best, saying that you cannot consider these crimes as crimes against humanity or the crime of genocide, because the notion was created after the events happened. This is not my point of view, but I would like to know your point of view and the legal position of the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine concerning the legal qualification. So we are speaking about genocide. We are speaking about genocide, which was integrated at the time in the concept of the crimes against humanity, as it was done in the charter of the new Nuremberg Tribunal. Correct? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Of course, everything we are talking about is inside the doctrine of the rule of law and the international law. Let's come back to the history of Nuremberg trials and trials of Far East. The situation was the same at that moment. And I think that it's clear for everyone that an act of genocide was committed, and we can't leave it impune because of the historical manipulations could be used by Russia at the moment. That's why we stand absolutely clear that our investigation, already supported in some elements by Ukrainian courts, is a necessary step in order to ensure accountability for the act of genocide, which was committed against Ukrainians during the Holodomor famine. Thank you.
Thank you, Prosecutor General. I just had a number of questions for you, if I may. First of all, what policy or plan do you have in place, or do you propose to put in place, in order to educate the next generation as to what really happened, in order to prevent history being manipulated by those who may spend time attempting to tell a different account? How do you propose that the next generation, particularly in Ukraine, should be fully aware of the events of 90 years ago?
It's a very important question, and thank you for asking this question, because when we go deep into the history and when we uncover the massive crimes committed, and when we have evidences of such crime committed, and when we can ensure the justice in due course of criminal proceedings and criminal trials, of course, we are establishing facts. We are re-establishing truth. And this truth should be shared not only for the historical reasons. This truth should be shared with current and new generations in order to prevent commission of such crimes, and in order for Ukrainians to support any other people in any other part of the world who suffer from the same crimes in their situation. Because this war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine showed us that international community should be united, not only in order to, not only for joint or the common political statements, but should be united to ensure justice. Because everyone from us, Ukrainians or any other nation of the civilized world, want to live in peace and want to live their life where their rights, their human rights, are respected, and any violation of their rights is properly prosecuted in order to stop them and to compensate any damage caused. So I think that it's not only a Ukrainian task to share this truth with our future generation. I think that this event is critically important to share the same facts with the international community, for them to share with their nations and for them to share and educate their children. Because having common knowledge about what has happened, having common understanding that these crimes should be prosecuted and justice delivered, we could be together in order to prevent commission of such crimes in the future.
Thank you, Prosecutor General. And I appreciate that, in fact, you're called to another meeting and can't be with us any longer. But can I thank you for your contribution to this debate and for outlining your intentions in this area. Thank you again.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Colleagues, what I would like to do now is invite our other experts to address us. And Mr. Abraham, in what order would you wish to call your experts to address us?
Thank you, Chairman. I would propose that Professor Schulze-Wessel is next, followed by Professor Etzer.
Thank you. Professor, could I invite you to address us for about 15 minutes? That's very kind of you, and thank you for being with us.
Okay, and I'm glad to have the possibility to present my insights to you. As the Prosecutor General stressed, the Holodomor must be seen on the backdrop of the current war, which is directed not only against the Ukrainian army, but against the Ukrainian people, against the Ukrainian nation, and therefore it has a genocidal dimension. And the Holodomor of the years 1932, 1933 has this genocidal dimension as well. It was a genocide. And it has, as Mr. Abraham stressed at the very beginning, it is an European issue. I mean, one has to understand that the Holodomor was the greatest mass crime of the Soviet Union, the greatest single mass crime again in the Soviet Union, which is not so widespread as an information. The history of the Holodomor has long been a history of forgetting. Soviet policy had a great interest in ignoring and forgetting the history of the Great Famine. If at all, Soviet historiography trivialized the famine by referring to it as a supply problem or interpreting it as a result of a natural disaster or a consequence of modernization. In fact, it had been brought about by the Soviet leadership consciously. Holodomor, this is the Ukrainian term, which goes back to the two Ukrainian words holod and mor, for hunger and death. And the victims of the famine were mainly the rural population in Ukraine, as well as in the Kuban region, in Kazakhstan, and in the Volga-Ural region. Although there's no decree explicitly ordering the Holodomor, there's no doubt that the Soviet regime and Stalin personally were responsible for the mass deaths. In the course of collectivization and forced industrialization, Stalin demanded excessive quotas for grain from the farmers. But that was not all. In order to gain foreign currency, the Soviet Union exported wheat to Western European countries despite the ongoing catastrophe. At the height of crisis, the party sent troops into the villages to mercilessly take out grain, even seeds, livestock, vegetables, in short, everything which could be eaten. The situation became inescapable for the farmers in Ukraine when Stalin ordered the famine areas to be sealed off. Mortality rates in the Ukrainian countryside fluctuated between 10 and 60%. At the same time, the Kremlin ran a campaign against Ukrainian writers and artists, which had the character of a cultural war against Ukrainian national cultures. Both aspects together, the targeted starvation of Ukraine, resulting in mass deaths, and the attack on Ukrainian language and culture, gave the Soviet actions a genocidal character. The Soviet policy against Ukraine has a wider historical connection with Great Russian policy against Ukraine in the 19th century. The Tsarist Empire had been pursuing a policy against Ukraine since the 1860s. The Kremlin wanted to prevent the emergence of a powerful Ukrainian national movement that would challenge the primacy of Russian culture in the Tsarist Empire. The Kremlin therefore issued language bans against Ukrainian, for example. The Russian Revolution in 1917 initially broke with this tradition. In other words, Bolshevik rule was not directed against the peoples of the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Empire, such as the Ukraine from the outset. In the 1920s, the Bolsheviks even tried to win over the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union to socialism with a positive nationalities policy. This course became now known as Korenizatsiya, the rooting of socialism. Its basic idea was to implement socialism among the non-Russian peoples, such as the Ukrainians, by accommodating them. Public life among the non-Russian peoples was converted to the respective national language. In the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, Ukrainian became the official language and Ukrainian culture was promoted for some years in the 1920s. However, under Stalin, that is since 1928, the Kremlin returned to the old national imperial path of pre-revolutionary Great Russian politics. Stalin had first recognized a threat to the Soviet state from Ukraine during the civil war in 1919. Ukraine appeared to him as a threat that could break away from the Soviet state in alliance with democratic and national Poland. During the years of the Holodomor, this view became Stalin's obsession. In view of the setbacks of the collectivization policy, Stalin painted the devil on the wall in April 1932. He expressed his fears to the Ukrainian communist leader Stanislav Kozyr that Soviet power had apparently ceased to exist in some places in Ukraine. At the same time, he confided the Politburo member Lazar Kaganovich, the main thing, Stalin said, the main thing is now Ukraine. Things are terrible in Ukraine. Things are terrible for the party. In panic over the continued existence of Soviet power, the Politburo issued two secret decrees in December 1932, which appealed to the revolutionary vigilance of the regional and local party levels. The concept of national rootedness, that is, this concept of korenizacja propagated in the 1920s, the Ukrainization of public life, was now held responsible for the failure of collectivization. The Moscow Politburo called for a campaign against bourgeois nationalist elements. 200,000 Ukrainians were arrested, mainly teachers, journalists, professors, writers, artists, and clergy. In the following year, Ukrainian educational institutions were purged, closed, or rededicated. The paradigm shift in Ukrainian policy was followed by another decree concerning the grievances in the countryside. On January the 1st, 1933, Stalin ordered the persecution of farmers who had grain. This order intensified the requisitioning measures that led to the worst phase of mass deaths in Ukraine. Stalin viewed the disastrous consequences of his policy through national lens, seeing national Ukrainian saboteurs or Polish actors at work. The deliberate intensification of the strangulation of Ukraine in the final phase of the Holodomor was obviously caused by Stalin's anti-Ukrainian obsession. Now that the practice of taking out grain tightened once again, the number of victims rose into the millions. The suppression of the memory of the famine is part of the attempted genocide that the Soviet Union also perpetrated against the Kazakhs during this period, 1 to 1.5 million of whom died. But there were survivors of the Holodomor who reported what they had seen and experienced. There are diaries of the victims, and there are interviews with the survivors from the 1980s. And this is the topic of a book Jaroslav Rydzak and me are editing. Even during the Holodomor, many reports about the crime reached the outside world. The reporting of the Welsh journalist Gareth Jones, who transmitted news and wrote reports from the Soviet Union for American, British, and German newspapers in 1932 and 33, became famous. In March 1933, he boarded a train in Moscow bound for Kharkiv. He got off at a small railway station in Ukraine, continued on foot, met people swollen with hunger, and came across deserted villages. Jones witnessed what he described as a famine of enormous proportions. 2 weeks later, he traveled to Germany and informed the world public at an international press conference in Berlin. News of the famine reached numerous newspapers such as the Chicago Daily News, the Yorkshire Post, the Sun, Manchester Guardian, Time Magazine, the New York Times, La Liberté, and several German press organizations. Soviet-influenced journalists and intellectuals contradicted the reports and spread trivializing interpretations that spoke of supply bottlenecks that could be explained against the background of Stalin's huge industrialization program. Gareth Jones was the best known, but by no means the only journalist who disseminated knowledge about the Holodomor to the West. In fact, news about the Holodomor reached Western and Central Europe. In some cases, the famine was interpreted already then as a deliberate weapon used by the Soviet government against the Ukrainian people, which corresponds to the later definition of the genocide. The German embassy and consulates in the Soviet Union were also informed in detail about the Holodomor. German diplomats drew a remarkably precise picture of the Holodomor based on their knowledge and of eyewitness accounts. In addition to the diplomats, other professional groups were involved in the transfer of knowledge. Church circles, as well as German workers and engineers who made observation on the ground. And that means that the whole horror of the genocide was known already then. And of course, it was researched much later. Only in the 1980s appeared the first comprehensive book on the Holodomor, and it has to be kept in mind today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to open up for questions again, as we did before. But could I begin with one question? Was the whole issue, or any part of the issue, ever raised in the League of Nations?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, no.
So the one international institution that could have commented on this appears to have been silent, perhaps because of ignorance or otherwise.
Or because of the Soviet Union and then Russia as part of the Security Committee
Of the League of Nations at that time. It was a thank you.
Yeah.
Can I invite colleagues if they would like?
Yes, maybe it will be a little bit controversial question, and maybe it would be rather better to ask the Prosecutor General of Ukraine of that, but I will ask you. What do you think? You see, what was the aim of the Holodomor? Just to kill Ukrainians. And what is the aim of today's war of aggression in Ukraine? Just to kill Ukrainians, because Putin several times said that Ukraine is a nation, he doesn't know such a nation. And if you will be not Russified, you shouldn't live. And so on and so on. Medvedev and others are saying totally the same. Maybe we should look on these two things like one, continuing crime, because the aim is the same, to kill Ukrainians as a nation. The organizers are also the same, the political leadership of the Soviet Union at that time, and they are successors, because the Russian Federation are saying we are the successors of the Soviet Union. So the leadership of the Russian Federation, who is the successor of the Soviet Union, are organizers of the today's war. So maybe it is just one crime, the Holodomor and today's war of aggression in Ukraine, just continuing crime. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. That makes it possible to discuss a little bit the details. I agree totally with regard to the current war. I mean, it's a war against the Ukrainian nation, and Putin said this from the very beginning. It's totally clear, and it is that there's a great harmony, so to say, in theory and in practice. Putin said what he wanted to do, and the Russian army, have a look at Bucha, realized it. So that there is no doubt that the Russian war against Ukraine has a genocidal dimension from the very beginning. Already in July 2021, Putin said that he would not accept an independent Ukraine, and therefore he made it clear even before the war that he would not accept Ukraine with a political free will, and that he would not accept an independent Ukrainian culture. And this war, as I said at the very beginning, is not only against the Ukrainian army, and the aim of the war is not to get part of Ukraine, but the war is directed against the Ukrainian people. With regard to the Holodomor, I would agree that it's that it was also targeted against the Ukrainian people, and that the outcome, of course, is a genocide. There's no question. But your question was, is it one crime? Is there a continuity? And being a historian, I would say the basis of Stalin's policy towards Ukraine is an anti-Ukrainian sentiment from the beginning on. And there I would see the continuity. I mean, Stalin was always anti-Ukrainian, and he was always in favor of a great Russian state, and only tactically he was in favor of this Soviet construction of a multinational state. And during the industrialization process, a situation arose in which Stalin could realize this anti-Ukrainian mood. I would put it this way. Yeah. So I think my opinion is very close to yours, but the situation now, even before the war, is much clearer than it was before the collectivization process in the Soviet Union. We can reconstruct Stalin's attention only in the Holodomor, after the Holodomor, and we can reconstruct Putin's intention even before the war.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Badania.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting visualization. I don't want to even challenge any fact because my grandmother was at that time in Krasnodar region in Kuban, and it was a starvation. It's not too far from Krasnodar to Tbilisi, to the capital of Georgia, but when she told me that when her father decided to remove their kids from Krasnodar, which is was considered, still considered, as one of the most wealthy region of Russia at that time, we see that Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, was, and all Georgia was actually very wealthy and healthy, and very, there was not even information or even any knowledge about starvation in other regions. So this is an additional evidence that it was done specially to eliminate the Ukrainian/Kazakh population in this region. But I have some other questions concerning the following one. So when we are discussing the destruction, of the human group. Do we have any clue about whether we, not we, but the Stalin at that time, had the intention to destroy the Ukrainians as a social group or as an ethnic group? I'm saying this taking into account that nobody, believe me, nobody will try to challenge the very facts of Holodomor. The most denialist movement will start from the legal qualification of Holodomor. They would say how you prove the special intent, how you prove the possibility of using this notion to before the creation of this notion and so on. And I would like to know which kind of level of denialism of Holodomor qualification you see nowadays in the scientific literature.
I think I can give a clear answer to this. I mean, the Genocide Convention demands that a group, a national or ethnic or religious group, is targeted as such. And one can say, and this is the Russian argument, that many people, even Russians, were concerned by the famine, and even Russians in southern Russia died. This is true. And by the way, the Russian ambassador in Germany, he stated it was a Soviet experience and it should be commemorated as a Soviet experience which even connects the people of the Soviet Union, even after the end of the Soviet Union. And I think it's very important not to accept this. It's not a Eurasian lieu de mémoire or site of memory. It's a European site of memory in which one European nation, in which one European nation, Ukraine, was targeted from Russia, and how to show that this was consciously done and that Ukrainians were targeted as such. I think important are two elements. One element is the starvation policy as such, which was extremely severe in Ukraine. There were special measures which were not taken in southern Russia. And the second point is that it was a war, a cultural war against Ukrainian teachers, against Ukrainian artists, and so on. That is, Stalin wanted the Ukrainian culture to disappear, and at the same time, he fought a war against Ukrainian peasants. And these two elements, the cultural element and the starvation policy, make it a genocide in the sense of the Genocide Convention of 1948.
Mr. Esther,
Of course, I'm covered already by Mr. Vlasenko and Mr. Vartanian, but I would like to ask, that was Stalin's personal decision, or was something behind him? I mean, the elite, the Soviet elite, wanted to eliminate the Ukrainian people or culture. I mean, it was something which, because after Stalin, we had Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian. So I want some of your comments on that.
Excuse me. History is not such simple. I mean, I would say certainly Stalin, although he is not a Russian by birth, yeah, he was extremely great Russian motivated, and he was certainly against Ukraine. He thought that he saw a threat from Ukraine in connection with Poland, and therefore he pursued an anti-Ukrainian policy without any doubt. And I think among the Bolsheviks, he is the most anti-Ukrainian politician. for example, in comparison to Lenin. But this was not the same time, of course. But even in the early 1920s, especially in 1919, as I mentioned, Stalin's policy was directed against Ukraine. And I would say that all Bolsheviks were in a certain tradition of the Tsarist Empire, and this Tsarist Empire had a great Russian DNA, which was directed against Ukraine. The attempt of Lenin in the 1920s was to get rid of the great Russian tradition in order to implement socialism also in non-Russian regions. And for a short period of time, this anti-Ukrainian mood became weaker, and the socialist policy, this policy of implementing socialism in the non-Russian cultures became stronger. But under Stalin, the tide turned, and therefore it became less ambivalent. And after Stalin, I would say a new story began. One cannot say that Khrushchev was anti-Ukrainian, although there were migration policies also after Stalin, which were anti-Ukrainian. So there are many ambiguities.
Thank you, Professor. I know that colleagues will have further questions, but at this stage, I'm going to invite our next expert, Professor Ritsak, to join us online, and then invite colleagues to come back with questions, both for him and for Professor Schultz-Pessel. So could we have Professor Ritsak online, please? Professor Ritsak, can I invite you to join us, please? I understand that Professor Ritsak is reconnecting, so if we wait just a moment, thank you. Well, colleagues, it would appear that we're having difficulty in reconnecting with Professor Ritsak. So in the meantime, and just as I announced that, we're told that he is coming back. That's the way to deal with it.
There he is.
Right. Good afternoon, Professor Ritsak. Thank you for joining us. Can you hear me? We cannot hear you. You're muted at the present time. It would appear that Professor Ritsak is having difficulty, although we can see him, we can't hear him. So what I would suggest is that we resume with Professor Schultz-Wessel, and it now rests upon your shoulders to take the rest of the questions from colleagues, I'm afraid. Can I ask Sir Christopher Chope if he has a question? Thank you.
Can we get a perspective as to whether we think the Holocaust or the Holodomor was worse? And do you think that Ukraine was badly served by the decision of the United Kingdom and the United States to open a second front and thereby enable Stalin to resist Hitler's advance into Russia? If we hadn't opened that second front, if we hadn't indulged Stalin, would Ukraine have been better off than it turned out to be?
I'll be interested in your answer, Professor.
Yeah, well, I think the Holocaust is, I would say, the crime of crimes, and it's the Holodomor is also a genocide, but of course the Nazi Germany had. It was clear that the challenge of Nazi Germany had to be taken by Western allies as well. So the second front was necessary, certainly, for the crimes of Nazi Germany, which were also crimes against Ukrainians, by the way. I mean, no other country had so many people who were taken for forced labor to Germany than the Ukrainians. So Nazi Germany waged a war against the Jews, but also against Ukrainians and many other people. So the second front was a very good idea. And what would have happened if Nazi Germany had won the war, I do not want to imagine.
Well, we don't need to speculate, Professor, but thank you.
Yeah.
So the United Kingdom doesn't have anything to apologize for?
No, you don't have at all.
Sorry, Ms. Vasilenko, you wanted to ask a question of the Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, and thank you to our rapporteur. Indeed, this report takes our assembly, but also society at large, a long way from where we were in 2010, when a similar report was produced by the political committee. Of course, 2010 was the year when this organization was under rather heavy influence from the aggressor state itself, the aggressor state, which today, instead of repeating the phrase never again, says like a mantra the phrase, we can repeat again. We can repeat again what? We can repeat again the crimes that are listed in this report and that you, Professor, have in so detail just accounted for us. And there are many, many more crimes for that. So the reason for that being, and I think this is the logical conclusion to which we can all come, is because not once was Russia held accountable for the crimes that they were committing. Not once in the whole of the history, for not a single crime. This is why today Russia is again attempting a crime of genocide, quite successfully attempting a crime of genocide against the Ukrainian people, but also using food as a weapon of war. We all know very well what the grain blockages and the export blockages are causing in the rest of the world. Again, because Russia went unpunished and unaccounted for. So the question is, do you think that it is not just right and important that we set the historical record straight and that we bring the light on historical justice, but that we also need to have a stronger and more concrete accountability of the perpetrators of the crimes and of the country of Russia as the successor state of the Soviet Union for the crimes that were committed back then, for the Holodomor, for the genocide of the Ukrainian people by famine. There are already class actions being filed, there are actions being filed, there's more and more documents which are being uncovered by the, in a number of countries, by the SBU of Ukraine especially, in the archives. So the facts are there, the data is there, the evidence is there. Do you think there's any perspective for this class action, and do you think it is a crucial point in making sure that there really is a never again? Thank you.
Well, accountability, even in a historical perspective, is very important. So my answer is yes. And by the way, this Russian word, we can do it again. In Russian, it's можно повторить. It is not coined with regard to Ukraine. I mean, it's meant, of course, also with regard to Ukraine. But originally, it was coined against Germany. We can do it as we did it in the Second World War. We can occupy Berlin. Of course, this is not the actual situation, but there's a permanent threatening from Russia that not only Ukraine, but also the complete European security order is under threat from Russia. And this, we can do it again, reminds us of Second World War, the Soviet triumph in the Second World War, and it is intended to make us fear Russia. And this is one intention we have to be aware of.
Thank you. Colleagues, I understand we may now be able to have Professor Rydzek online, so I think we will make a further attempt to take Professor Rydzek, if we may. Could you switch off your microphone?
Excuse me, I'm here. Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Is there
We can hear you, Professor. Please continue.
I'm very sorry, Mr. President. I'm very sorry, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, for this kind of technical issues. Since the time is limited, let me just jump into discussion and answer the question that was already raised in the discussion. First of all, comparison with Holocaust, which I believe extremely important in a sense, in many senses. And just to put for the very on the table, in my understanding of many Ukrainians, Holodomor is second largest genocide in global history after Holocaust. So just compare, if you're talking about numbers of victims on the Holocaust, 6 to 7 millions. In case of Ukraine, Holodomor is 4 to 5 millions. Without a doubt, any comparison does look well, it's on the line. So we should understand what are the similarity, what the differences. Difference is very important here. And difference here that unlike Hitler plans to describe Jews as a race, the plan of Stalin was to erase Ukrainian as a nation. And this is something which I believe are very important. But before I address this issue, let me again return to the scale of the victims. and reason why Ukraine has been chosen. There is a long discussion, ongoing discussion, which was already raised here in the room, whether Holodomor was against peasants as a social group or as an ethnic group. So the answer was both, because the understanding of Stalin, the main social base for nationalism was peasants. This is what he explicitly has written before the First World War in his important treatise, A Marxism and National Question, which is kind of textbook for many communists since the establishment of the Soviet Union. For the Stalin understanding, the resistance of peasants was both social and national resistance. Unfortunately, I could not show you the map which I prepared, but this is map based on the statistics of peasant uprising during Stalin collectivization. As a matter of fact, peasants resisted everywhere in the Soviet Union, in Ural, in Siberia, in Caucasus, in South Volga, but particularly in Ukraine. The difference between all these rebellions and Ukrainian one was twofold. First of all, the numbers and the intensity. Half of all the rebellions that were at that time in Soviet Union was in Ukraine. So this was the most intense rebellions. And secondly, more importantly, I believe that in many cases, these rebellions had clear national dimension. So in many senses, Ukrainian peasants has raised a national slogan, and sometimes they will sing national anthems when they were rebelling against Stalin. So basically, this is the story. This is statistic of 1930, and Stalin was aware of this statistic. This statistic was presented in 1932 after the first wave of collectivization and the first wave of famine. So many addressing this issue, was the Holodomor genocide or not? Was it social or national genocide? We have to take into account that we're talking about a famine as a famine of 1932 and 33. This is largely true, but then you have a differences here. And this is different has been made by the leading expert on the famine, and this is Italian historian Andrea Graziosi, who studied Holodomor in details, but also in the larger context of the Soviet politics. So the story is, we would preferably to talk not about one famine, but about two famines. Not famine of 1932 or 33, but famine of 32 and famine of 33. The famine of 32 was response to Soviet collectivization and was largely a result of mismanagement. In this sense, it was really kind of the famine which affected all the ethnic groups, and Ukrainians, Russians, Kazakhs. By the way, the largest number of losses at that first wave of 32 was among the Kazakhs. And in this sense, this famine was not strictly genocide in a sense that any group was chosen. But when in 1932, Stalin became aware of the statistic of the peasants' resistance. And in this statistic, Ukraine really was different, very much different from other republics. Stalin started to believe that there's something wrong with Ukraine, that this must be some kind of Western plot against his power, orchestrated by the West. In the first case, what he is claiming by Poland and Japan. So this is exactly in this time, in the summer 32, Stalin started treating Ukrainians differently, and we have a letter written to Kaganovich, Lazar Kaganovich, who at that time the leader of the Communist Party in Ukraine, in which Stalin raises his concern that we will lose in Ukraine. That statistics show differently, that statistics show clearly, explicitly, is that Ukraine is very much different. That Ukraine is the flame of the anti-communist rebellions. If Ukraine would be pacified, again and again, he repeated twice in this letter, we may lose the Ukraine. So in the summer of 1932, Stalin orchestrated additional famine. And this famine was exactly aimed and pointed at Ukraine separately. And this, how we have the second wave of the famine was strictly genocide. Just give me one example, probably. Data tells a lot. Without the second wave, the numbers of the losses, human losses in Ukraine would be slightly smaller than 1 million, something around the 900,000 Ukrainian lives of peasants. With the second wave, this was the 4 million. So to give you the idea of difference. So again, this is very much comparable But again, this must be, Ukraine was highlighted in Stalin's plan as a region which was extremely unreliable. It was supposed to be set as a bridge to bring communist revolution from Russia into Germany, into the West, but it's turned to be in the Trojan horse of the Soviet Union. So therefore, Stalin demanded to treat Ukraine differently and orchestrated this kind of the famine. How far it was different from Holocaust? Without doubt, it's very much different. Again, because in the case of Stalin, he would hardly have plans to eliminate all Ukrainians. It was physically impossible. Khrushchev made this kind of the joke, which could have some kind of truth in that. During the second 20th Congress of Communist Party, which was in 1956, the joke like that Stalin had a plan to deport all Ukrainians to Siberia, very much like he did with the Chechen or Crimean Tatars. The only obstacle was, according to Khrushchev, that there was not sufficient number of trains and wagons to bring 30 million of Ukrainians toward Siberia. But basically, plan was there. So I think,
Professor, could you speak a little more slowly for the benefit of colleagues and the interpreters?
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. So the story is the Stalin aim was not to destroy Ukraine as an ethnic group. The aim of Stalin to destroy Ukraine as a nation, to relegate Ukrainians from the status of nation to the status of ethnic group, very much like he did with Chuvash, with Mari, with Yakuts, and other ethnic groups. Let me draw your attention that there was recently in Moscow, there was an attempt to organize a new oppositional party toward Putin, and this party was anti-Putin party was attended Congress by many people, by representative of indigenous people, and what they claimed, and this is something which resonates with the Stalin politics, that they were being told, these ethnic groups, that your only work is to sing and dance. You have no right to pretend that you are a national group, and therefore you have not to fight for the political rights and specifically for representation in the parliament. So this is exactly the point. So I believe in many senses, this is why we see this war very much similar to Stalin plans, because I don't believe Putin has a physical possibilities or capacities to destroy all Ukrainians, some 40 million. His aim is very much similar to Stalin, which is erase the crucial groups, the groups which represent national identity. And this is national elites. At that time, it was the intellectuals, intelligentsia, and core of this peasant uprising. Nowadays, Ukraine ceased to be a peasant nation. Since the 1960, a larger number of Ukrainians living in the cities. More so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have a kind of the shift from industrial economy to service economy, so to say, and we have a race of the new core class, which may a core of the Ukrainian nation, and I would define the core as a new middle class in the sense that it represents mostly service economy that deals with IT, with mass media, with other services. And I believe in many senses, Zelensky and his team is epitome of this class. But basically, the aim of Russia, of Putin, is the same, to eliminate specifically this group. Unlike in the 1930s, this group nowadays is extremely large. And therefore, it also helps us understand why Ukrainians are putting their resistance to this, because they remember that. My final point. Ukrainians tend to disagree on many issues, especially dealing toward the past. I don't believe this is something extremely or exceptional Ukrainian. You could have it in Belgian case, in Polish case, or in United States case. It's rather natural to have a disagreement about many issues. But there is one issue in Ukraine nowadays about historical memory that there's a total consensus. And this is consensus about the Holodomor. Since under Yushchenko, there was a law that accepted by the Ukrainian parliament that qualified Holodomor as a genocide, there is large consensus among all Ukrainians, regardless they are speaking Ukrainian or Russian language, whether they belong to Donbass or Galicia, west or east, north or south, there is a consensus, that Holodomor was artificial, that it was orchestrated by Stalin, and more importantly, that it was a genocide. And the number increased significantly with the beginning of the war. Nowadays, the consensus has a 92% population that believe that Holodomor was genocide. In many senses, I believe history plays an important role. History matters. Because if you want to understand why Ukraine are so resilient, why Ukraine is so persistent, because they remember the story of Holocaust. Even Holodomor. Even so, Holodomor was taboo under Soviet Union. This is a part of family stories. Practically every second family in Ukraine, both in one way or another, was affected by the Holodomor. It was part of the stories that were told by parents, grandparents to their kids and their grandchildren. So therefore, when Putin tried to persuade that those who are Russian speakers in Ukraine, they're really Russian, doesn't work. Because they may speak Russian, but they have different memory than Russians in Russia. Because they do remember the Holodomor as a part of their family stories. One of the crucial differences between Ukraine and Russia nowadays, there are many differences, but in terms of historical memory, if in Russia, Stalin is venerated as a great national hero, as the greatest national hero, that raised Russia to the status of superpower, so to say, and is especially venerated by Putin, in Ukraine, the situation is radically different. Stalin is the main anti-hero after Putin, because Ukrainians do remember what Stalin did to them. So just let me to conclude. I believe that in many senses, the current Russian-Ukrainian war is a war about history. Most of the arguments that Putin legitimizes his aggression with are of historical character. So we may say that history as the center of the war, but I would say that this is two different attitudes or different strategy, how to treat the past. Exactly we discussed nevermore, or we could repeat again. The point of Russia is to return to some kind of superpower status, which it has in the past, supposedly, is in Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So basically, the idea of Putin is very much similar to the idea of many populists, be it Orban or be it Trump. Let's make America great again. Let's return to pre-Tyrannon peace. Let's raise Russia from the knees. Basically, despite the differences, the presumption is the same. There has been golden age in the past, and we have to return to this golden age to establish our, so to say, normality. And I believe, in a sense, Ukraine is radically different. Luckily enough, Ukraine has no golden age. Ukraine has nowhere to return to, because Ukrainian history is marked by violence. And in this case of the violence, both Holodomor and Holocaust was the main territories of this violence. Therefore, Ukrainians do remember what war means, what kind of violence had effect on their society, and therefore slogan of Ukrainians is very much similar to European integration slogan, nevermore. And the only solution that Ukrainians see, a major solution, how to resolve this war, is to enter into European Union for a variety of reasons. First, because of the living standards, all the kind of thing, but most importantly, because Europe is no war zone. By joining Europe, Ukrainians exactly try to leave the past behind. And this has believed help us to understand and reconnect a memory of Holocaust, of Holodomor, and nowadays war. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Abraham, could I invite you to come in?
Yeah, also warmest thanks to you, Professor, from my side as a rapporteur. We had a very specific point in the previous discussion. I would love to come back for a second. This is the role of journalists, observers, witnesses of the Holodomor. Had there been an outcry in the Western public back then by these reports? And if not, why not? Is it comparable to today's situation in a way or another? And secondly, the role of certain observers who were publicly denying what was happening. Maybe some more details on that.
Yeah. So indeed there was no outcry, and this is astonishing, one could say. And I think it's due, on the one hand, to the very professional influence policy of the Soviet Union, they had their journalists, their politicians, their people to contradict to the eyewitness reports and even to professional journalists as Gareth Jones. And the second point is that the public sphere in Europe at that time, and even the national public spheres in Europe at that time, were divided between left and right. And it were mostly the right-wing journals which took up the news from Russia, from Ukraine, about the Holodomor, and it was not the left-wing press. And therefore, the scope of information was somehow, could have been wider than it was.
Thank you. I think that brings us to the conclusion of this part of the session. I would like to thank all of our experts, including the Prosecutor General, who's no longer with us, for their contributions. Professor Rutzke, we quite understand the technical difficulties that can emerge. They emerge not infrequently on these occasions, but we're most grateful for your contribution, which was extremely useful and extremely helpful. Professor Schultz-Wessel, thank you as well. I don't know, Mr. Abraham, if you have any final remarks to make.
No, just another warm thank you, and I feel the burden of responsibility to bring all that into the report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you. Colleagues, I intend to go on to the next matter on the agenda, which is the detention of Julian Assange. And our rapporteur, Ms. Eva Dotter, is now with us. And I would begin by inviting her to present her introductory memorandum. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, in 2010, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published thousands of classified US documents, many of which revealed war crimes, widespread use of torture, and other grave breaches of international human rights and humanitarian law. One of the most famous of the materials published by WikiLeaks was the collateral murder video, which was an audio and video recording from a US attack helicopter over Baghdad. It showed an American attack on a group of people that were believed to be Iraqi insurgents. Among them were two Reuters reporters. One of them was killed instantly in the initial attack. The second one sustained serious injuries and was later seen attempting to crawl to safety.